Freedom. Freedom is a very powerful word, and it's a word that always resonates with human dignity, with freedom. Well, with freedom, yeah, with democracy, with the liberty of the human spirit, to put it um, that way, in rather poetic terms. Freedom, very powerful thing. Um, but I think sometimes we need to actually consider what we mean by freedom. I think if you look throughout history, when you look at independence movements, liberation movements, emancipation movements, in the case of slavery, um, freedom is often literally about life and death. Now, one of the most prominent examples of freedom or the concept of freedom in the world today, I would say, is the struggle of the Ukrainian people against the Russian aggressors, against the Russian invasion. The freedom in this context is to free themselves from Russian oppression, from Russian um, occupation, at least as it is now in the south west of the country, southeast of the country, I should say. In the 1990s, freedom to South Africans was freedom from apartheid, black South Africans. Um, but there's lots of other contexts that, with this word, very powerful meaning in Taiwan to the Uyghur people. When we're talking about totalitarian regimes like the Communist Party of China, freedom has a real resonance with those struggling against that. In this sense, freedom, I think, is very closely related to human rights, which to me is not just a buzzword. I think, unfortunately, human rights has become, um, it's almost seen as a taboo concept, when really it should just be universal. Uh, Indeed, we could talk about freedom of homosexual people in Qatar, LGBT people, to be more broad about that. Um, this is just a very quick point. It's not about the main video, but just a very quick point. Majid Nawaz, man I used to respect, former Islamist, ostensibly, LBC presenter, activist. Unfortunately, last couple of years he's went down a real rabbit hole, and I'm sad to see that he's now in the business of putting out pro Russia narratives on Twitter. I'm sad to see that because I always thought Nawaz was a sensible guy, a voice of reason, a centrist. Indeed, he once stood for the Liberal Democrats. So it's sad to see people who, you think are intelligent, you think are, and I'm sure he still is, but it's like he's went down this rabbit hole. It's not really anything to do with the video, just mention it in passing. Yeah, if you're familiar with who I'm talking about, and you know my views on Russia and Ukraine, his latest posts on Twitter are revealing, and it's sad to see. I know he has very strong views about lockdown and the COVID measures, which is fine, but I think he's went down a different path now, and it's sad to see. But actually, I say it's irrelevant to the video, maybe not, because when we talk about freedom, it gets into all sorts of debates about the extent of freedom. And this is something that actually warrants a closer look, because I'm going to say this right now. Absolute freedom, in my opinion, does not exist. It's never existed, and it never will exist. And if it was to exist 100%, I believe you would have absolute anarchy. And this is why. You know, freedom is always spoken about in the case of human liberty and freedom from oppression, freedom to have basic human rights, freedom of expression, freedom of faith. All those things are very valuable, very important. And we shouldn't take for granted freedom in Western liberal democracies. There are some times that legislation could be put forward that is questionable. I would say, for example, in this country, some of the legislation in recent years, ostensibly to protect minority people, can, in my view, be abused. to shackle freedom of expression, particularly around issues like trans rights. We need to be very careful about that. We also need to be careful that we don't see creeping blasphemy legislation masquerading as a way to, prevent Islamophobia or something like that. Um, so, of course, any new legislation needs to be very closely scrutinized. But I do part ways with neo-libertarians. That is people, as I would see it, who really you wonder, do they have any red lines at all? Do they have any limitations? Now, I don't think there's many people that genuinely believe there should be no laws and people can do whatever they want. But I think some libertarians don't help their own case because, if some people have a knee-jerk response of ban it, frankly, some libertarians have a knee-jerk response of don't ban it, legalize everything. Now, to me, that is just as reckless and just as questionable. Let me give a few examples here. Child pornography. I think any responsible adult with a conscience would recognize that as something that is extremely harmful because it is inevitably based on exploitation of vulnerable young people, children. And I don't think it's good enough to say, oh, well, he or she was just looking at it, they don't intend to act. Maybe not, but it's still fueling that filthy trade. It's still fueling an evil crime, which is literally it's difficult to even talk about, but it is what it is. Now, those who get into this knee-jerk thing of freedom, 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 it's absolute. If you really believe that, you would, by extension, say, well, child pornography should be allowed. It's freedom. But we don't allow it because there's victims involved, children. It's about safeguarding vulnerable people. So there's a very sensible reason why, in most jurisdictions, that is banned. Why it's banned on the internet. When I upload a video, there's a little message saying, does this video contain, I think it says, content aimed at children? And I press no because my content isn't aimed at children. But there is safeguarding. That's sensible, and I don't think many people would argue against that. I read a report in the Eye about, it was in the Daily Mail as well, actually, about the so-called drill artist Kings, um, and a song that he's uploaded. That's not his real name; he won't reveal his real name. But apparently, Instagram took it down. Well, their parent company Meta had it taken down from an Instagram platform in January. It's all been reinstated. Apparently, the Metropolitan Police asked them to. Their position is they only remove content if it violates their community guidelines and breaks local laws. But the contention is this: the Met, rightly in my view, say that drill music, particularly these sort of videos, they literally incite gang warfare. And this particular video apparently had references to named rivals, right? So when you get that, because the drill community is relatively small, they're literally naming people. Now, I've made no secret of my distaste for this so-called genre, but this is a useful example because absolutists would say, "Oh, it's just a form of expression," and they would put blinkers on to the fact that it actually has real-world influences. I've never accepted this argument that art is totally harmless. I mean, you can't have it both ways. You can't boast about the power and the influence of art if that's how you see it, but simultaneously say, "Oh, but don't criticize it. It's just art. It's just expression." So either it is influential or it isn't. You can't sort of say. I don't think you can say that it's if it's influential, then therefore there's nothing in the debate about what negative influence it could have. Um, So I've never agreed with that. I've never agreed with this idea that art is totally harmless. This is not to say that everyone who watches a violent film or listens to rap music is going to go out and commit a crime. Of course not. That's a common sense caveat. But the thing with drill music, it's very specific, very specific. This isn't a big mainstream genre. I mean, I don't like rap, but I recognize that it's widespread. You know, it covers a lot of different things. Some of it's political. I do think a lot of it's trash nowadays. But that's just my opinion. But I do recognize that's more mainstream. Broadly speaking, with drill, you could be almost certain that drill artists will have a criminal record. Call that prejudice, but it is every single time. You know, you see that there is a correlation there, that there is criminality deeply embedded in the culture of this music. So I totally support radio stations, for example, refusing to play that. Now, this gets into the issue of censorship, right? So absolutists would say, I mean, let's look at Twitter and the whole ban on Trump. He's been reinstated because Musk done a poll. Well, I've mixed views on that. On one hand, it's democracy. He asked the community, and they told, they asked for Trump to be reinstated. That's direct democracy. But I do understand the controversy around it because Trump is a flamethrower. This is a disgraced former president who, in my view, is quite unstable, and in my view, does incite inflammatory rhetoric and trouble. So I think it's profoundly naive to think that someone in that position, a former president of the United States, that their words are harmless. This is what people forget when it comes to the whole free speech debate. Yes, there's free speech, but there's also influence of the words that we say. I'm acutely aware that all these videos that I make, not that I have a massive base, but people watch them. I'm responsible for every word that I utter. If I make a mistake, I'll amend it, take responsibility for it. But this thing about absolutism, absolute anything is not a good idea. There's some things, you could be absolute on um, premeditated murder without motivation. That's wrong. I think you can take an absolute stance on that. Um, but many things are more nuanced, more black and white. So with absolute freedom, it just does not exist because if it did, you could do anything you want. This is why I think this debate gets a little bit blinkered sometimes. People say, oh, well, if you support censorship, you're a totalitarian. My instinct is not for censorship. And I think in most cases it's not justified. I think people should have the freedom even to offend. Okay? I believe that. I don't think someone should be banned from a platform just for being controversial. However, and this is a big however, the side that people forget is if you have, let's say, a comedian who comes out with really tasteless jokes and people say it's offensive, their advocates will say it's freedom of speech. He or she, has a right to do that. But they forget that there's also freedom to criticize them. So if I want to say this particular comedian is their acts are tasteless, lazy, cruel, isn't that freedom to also say that? The thing about freedom is there's two sides to it. And I think some freedom absolutists, they forget that and they think that it's only freedom for them. So if you really are an absolutist, then be an absolutist. But I think it's misguided for the reasons that I've stated. In most cases, I think that there is more nuance. And people who think the words are harmless, a case that I've cited before because it's true. In 1994, so-called Hutu power radio stations that were operating in Rwanda literally incited the violence of the genocide. Now, I'm not saying they single-handedly were responsible for the genocide, but Rwanda's a small country. These radio stations were pumping out the most vociferous hatred, ethnic hatred against Tutsis and moderate Hutus. Almost certainly that had some role in the genocide. This was an era before social media. Goodness knows what it would have been like had Facebook and so on been around in 1994, possibly even worse. Um, but it annoys me when people think that words are harmless or freedom of an in of itself has no responsibility. Freedom without responsibility is what is it? It could potentially be inflammatory, and freedom without responsibility is a green light for every demagogue and dictator in history because it basically stipulates that they can say what they like because hey, it's freedom. I do think Trump's a wannabe dictator. I absolutely don't trust him. He achieved some things as president, but what he done in losing the election and what he has done since, just I think it makes him utterly unsuitable for the White House. But anyway, I'll leave it there. That's just something to think about. I don't believe in absolute freedom for the reasons I've stated. I don't believe people have a right to make threats. I don't believe people have a right to mercilessly bully someone for no reason. But I believe people should have the freedom to be blunt, to be controversial, even insulting. Because the thing about insult is it can be subjective. What one person's, let's say someone's critiquing Islamism, you wouldn't want a situation where Islamists say, oh, like they're being Islamophobic. So I would certainly err on the side of having as much flexibility as possible, but I stopped short of saying there's absolute freedom because there isn't. Let me know your thoughts.